The moment someone asks for a key to your house, you learn whether they see your home as yours or theirs. I did not realize how true those words were until a quiet Sunday dinner changed the way I looked at my family forever. My name is Jennifer Carter. I am 64 years old, retired after more than 3 decades teaching elementary school, and until recently I believed my relationship with my mother-in-law was reasonably healthy. Dorothy Carter was 81, energetic, outspoken, and deeply involved in everyone's lives. Sometimes too involved. But for years I told myself that was simply who she was. She loved her family. She had strong opinions. She liked being included. None of those things seemed dangerous. Looking back now, I can see that the warning signs were there long before I paid attention to them. The evening it all started seemed completely ordinary. Michael and I had invited Dorothy over for dinner. Our daughter Ashley was there too. The 4 of us sat around the dining room table eating roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The conversation drifted from holiday plans to neighborhood news, and eventually to home improvement projects. Michael mentioned that we had recently upgraded the locks on our front and back doors, after a neighbor experienced a break-in. It was a casual comment. Nobody thought much about it. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully and took a sip of iced tea. Then she smiled. Well, I suppose now is the perfect time for me to get a copy of the new key. The statement landed in the middle of the table like a dropped glass. Nobody spoke for a second. I actually thought she was joking. Ashley looked down at her plate. Michael gave a small laugh. Dorothy continued smiling as if she had requested an extra dinner roll. A key? Michael asked. Of course, Dorothy replied. Families should have access to each other's homes. What if there is an emergency? Her tone was light, reasonable, practical. The kind of tone that made disagreement seem unnecessary. Yet something inside me tightened immediately. I could not explain why. After all, she was family. She lived only 15 minutes away. She had never stolen anything. She had never caused a major problem. And yet the request unsettled me. Michael shrugged. We have not really talked about that. Dorothy waved her hand dismissively. Well, think about it. I am not getting any younger. Everyone laughed politely. The conversation moved on. At least it appeared to. The problem was that my mind stayed exactly where it was. Later that night, after Dorothy went home and Ashley left, I stood in the kitchen loading dishes into the dishwasher. Michael was drying plates beside me. What did you think about your mother's key request? I asked casually. Michael looked surprised. I do not know. I had not really thought about it. Would you want her to have one? He placed a plate into the cabinet. Maybe. Why? I hesitated. The truth sounded strangely dramatic even inside my own head. Because I do not. Michael frowned. Why not? That question should have been easy to answer. Instead, I found myself struggling. Nothing terrible had happened. Dorothy had not threatened us. She had not demanded ownership of the house. She simply wanted a key. Yet the idea bothered me. I guess I just like knowing our home is private, I finally said. Michael nodded slowly but did not seem convinced. It is not like she would move in. I forced a smile and returned to the dishes. The conversation ended there. But the feeling did not. That night, lying awake beside Michael, I replayed the dinner conversation over and over. What bothered me most was not the request itself. It was the assumption behind it. Dorothy had not asked whether we would be comfortable giving her a key. She had spoken as though receiving one was the natural next step. As though the decision had already been made, and we simply needed to catch up to it. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking everything. I had no idea that this simple request would eventually force every member of our family to confront a question much larger than a spare key. A question about boundaries, respect, and who truly gets to decide what happens behind a closed front door. Over the next few weeks, I tried convincing myself the entire situation would disappear on its own. People make unusual requests all the time. Sometimes they forget about them a few days later. Sometimes they realize the answer is no and quietly move on. I expected this to be one of those situations. Unfortunately, Dorothy seemed to have the exact opposite plan. The first reminder came during a family lunch at a small diner near her neighborhood. Ashley was there, Michael was there. And the conversation had been perfectly pleasant until the waitress brought dessert menus. Dorothy smiled across the table at me. Have you two made my key yet? The question sounded playful, almost harmless. Several people laughed. Michael smiled politely. I felt my stomach tighten. We have not discussed it yet, I answered. Dorothy tilted her head. What is there to discuss? She said it lightly, but the word stayed with me long after lunch ended. A week later, she brought it up again while visiting our house. This time she was standing in the kitchen helping me prepare vegetables for dinner. Out of nowhere she said, "You know, if I had a key, I could water your plants whenever you travel." I looked up from the cutting board. We already have neighbors who help with that. Dorothy nodded. Of course. But family should be first. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet somehow I spent the rest of the evening thinking about it. Every time she mentioned the key, she presented it as a practical solution to a problem nobody actually had. If we traveled, we had neighbors. If there was an emergency, we had security systems and local contacts. If we needed help, we knew how to ask for it. The key was not solving an existing problem. That realization made me increasingly uncomfortable. What troubled me even more was the way everyone else reacted. Michael never seemed bothered by the repeated requests. Ashley noticed them but usually stayed quiet. Friends I mentioned it to often shrugged and said things like, "She is family," or "She probably just wants to feel included." Maybe they were right. Maybe I was overreacting. I considered that possibility more than once. Then came Thanksgiving. Nearly 20 relatives gathered at my sister-in-law's house for dinner. The living room buzzed with conversation. Children ran through the hallways. Football played on television. It should have been a relaxing holiday. Instead, halfway through the afternoon, Dorothy found a way to bring up the key again. We were standing near the dessert table when she smiled and announced loudly enough for several relatives to hear, "I still cannot believe I do not have a key to my son's house." A few family members laughed. One aunt looked genuinely surprised. "Really?" she asked. Dorothy shook her head dramatically. "Can you imagine?" The group chuckled. I forced a smile. Inside, however, something shifted. For the first time, I realized this was no longer a private conversation. Dorothy was turning it into a public one. Not aggressively, not maliciously, but publicly nonetheless. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, relatives continued making small comments. Maybe they are keeping secrets in there. Maybe they do not trust anybody. Each remark was intended as a joke. Yet jokes often reveal assumptions people already believe. Driving home that evening, I stared out the passenger window while Michael focused on the road. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for weeks. "Have you noticed how often your mother brings up the key?" Michael sighed softly. "She does mention it a lot." "A lot." I turned toward him. "Michael, it comes up almost every time we see her." He remained quiet for several seconds. Maybe she just thinks it is funny. I looked back out the window. The passing streetlights reflected against the glass. Deep down, I knew this was not about humor anymore. Dorothy was planting an idea, repeating it, normalizing it. Every conversation made the request seem less like a request and more like an expectation. The most unsettling part was not her persistence. It was how natural she made it sound, as though refusing would eventually become stranger than agreeing. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether the key itself mattered less than what it represented. Because every time Dorothy brought it up, I felt less like the owner of my home, and more like someone being slowly persuaded to surrender a piece of it. The turning point arrived on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Although at the time it seemed like an ordinary family gathering, Michael and I were attending our nephew's birthday party at my sister-in-law's house. The weather kept everyone indoors, so nearly 20 relatives crowded into the living room and kitchen. Children played board games on the floor while adults moved between conversations. It should have been one of those comfortable family events where nobody thinks too hard about anything. Instead, I found myself standing beside the coffee table, listening to a conversation I never expected to hear. Dorothy was talking to two of Michael's cousins. I had not intended to eavesdrop, but my name suddenly came up. One cousin asked whether Dorothy planned to spend Christmas with us. Dorothy smiled and nodded. "Of course. Once I finally get a key, things will be much easier." The cousins laughed. One of them looked surprised. "Wait, They still have not given you one? Dorothy shook her head dramatically. Not yet. There was a pause. Then one cousin said something that immediately caught my attention. That seems strange. You are family. Dorothy shrugged. That is what I keep saying. She delivered the line with a smile, but the effect was powerful. Within seconds, the conversation shifted. Suddenly several people were discussing the situation. Most of them knew only a small fraction of the story. Yet opinions formed quickly. My mother has a key. My sister has one too. I thought everyone did that. Nobody asked whether I was comfortable with the arrangement. Nobody asked why Michael and I had not made a decision. The assumption seemed obvious to everyone. Dorothy should have a key. I stood quietly across the room pretending to watch the children play. Inside, however, I felt something uncomfortable growing. The issue was no longer staying between the people directly involved. It was becoming part of the family narrative. Later that afternoon, Ashley walked over carrying a paper plate with a slice of birthday cake. She immediately noticed my expression. What happened? She asked. I hesitated before explaining the conversation. Ashley listened carefully. Then she frowned. That is not fair. Her reaction surprised me. Why? I asked. Ashley looked genuinely confused by the question. Because Grandma keeps presenting it like a simple request. But she is leaving out the fact that you already said you are uncomfortable. I stared at her for a moment. The observation felt obvious once she said it. Yet somehow I had never framed it that way. Dorothy was sharing the disagreement without sharing the reason behind it. To everyone else, the situation appeared irrational. Why would a daughter-in-law refuse such a harmless request? The actual emotional context was missing. That evening, as Michael and I drove home, I finally decided to be more direct. I think your mother is turning the family into part of this conversation. Michael glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. What do you mean? I explained what I had overheard. To my surprise, he did not immediately defend her. Instead, he sighed. I can see why that would bother you. It was a small response. Yet it mattered because it was the first time he acknowledged that the situation might be affecting me differently than it affected him. When we arrived home, I made tea and sat alone at the kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The house felt quiet and safe. Normally, that feeling comforted me. This time it made me think. I looked around the room and imagined what it would feel like if someone else believed they were entitled to enter whenever they wished. The thought unsettled me more than ever. The key itself remained hypothetical. Nobody had one. Nothing had changed physically. Yet emotionally, everything felt different. Dorothy had managed to transform a private decision into a public question. More importantly, she had positioned herself as the reasonable party waiting for a simple favor. For the first time, I realized why the repeated requests exhausted me. It was not because she wanted access to the house. It was because every conversation subtly suggested that refusing her was unreasonable. And the longer that idea circulated through the family, the more isolated I began to feel. Sitting there alone with my tea, I started asking myself a difficult question. If everyone else thought the request was normal, was I truly protecting a boundary? Or was I becoming the problem? I did not know the answer yet. But I knew one thing. The pressure was no longer coming from a single person. It was slowly becoming a family expectation. For the next month, nothing officially changed, yet somehow everything felt different. Dorothy stopped asking directly quite as often, but the subject never truly disappeared. Instead, it lingered in small comments, casual observations, and passing remarks that seemed harmless on the surface. The strange part was that I found myself thinking about it even when Dorothy was nowhere around. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the guest bedroom when I caught myself wondering where we would keep an extra key if we ever gave her one. The thought stopped me immediately. I had not agreed to anything. Nobody had made a decision. Yet somehow I was already mentally preparing for a future I did not want. That realization bothered me more than I expected. A few days later, I mentioned it to Ashley when she came over for lunch. We sat at the kitchen table eating soup while sunlight poured through the windows. I think this situation is getting into my head, I admitted. Ashley looked up from her bowl. How? I explained what had happened while folding laundry. She listened quietly before setting down her spoon. Mom, that is what pressure does. I frowned. Pressure. Ashley nodded. When somebody repeats something often enough, your brain starts treating it like it is inevitable. Her words stayed with me long after she left. That evening, I walked through the house noticing things I had previously taken for granted. The family room where Michael and I watched movies. The kitchen where we shared coffee every morning. The back patio where we spent summer evenings talking about retirement plans. Every space held memories. Every room represented choices Michael and I had made together. Yet for the first time, I found myself imagining those spaces through someone else's expectations instead of my own. The feeling was difficult to explain. Dorothy had never threatened us. She had never demanded ownership of anything. But her repeated assumption that she should have access was slowly changing how I experienced the house itself. Around that time, Michael began noticing my discomfort more often. One Saturday morning, we were drinking coffee in the breakfast nook when he looked at me carefully and asked, "Are you still thinking about the key?" I laughed softly. Apparently more than I should. Michael stirred his coffee. "I do not understand why this has become such a big issue." His tone was not critical, just confused. I considered the question carefully. Then I answered with something I had only recently realized myself. Because it stopped being about the key weeks ago. Michael looked at me curiously. I continued. Every conversation feels like I am being asked to justify why I want privacy in my own home. He remained silent. For a moment I thought the point had missed him completely. Then he surprised me. "Do you feel like everyone is against you?" I hesitated before answering. "Not against me. Just already decided." The words hung in the air between us. Michael stared out the window toward the backyard. I never thought about it that way. Neither had I until recently. That was what made the situation so difficult. The actual request seemed small. Yet the emotional impact kept growing. A week later, another family gathering reinforced the feeling. During a holiday shopping trip with several relatives, someone jokingly asked whether Dorothy had finally received her key. The group laughed. Dorothy smiled. I forced a smile too. But inside I felt exhausted. Not because of the joke itself. Because the assumption behind it had become so widespread. People now spoke as though the outcome was predetermined, and only the timing remained uncertain. Driving home that evening, I stared at the holiday lights decorating houses throughout the neighborhood. Most looked warm and inviting. Safe, private, personal. Suddenly I realized what had been bothering me all along. A home is not just a building. It is a boundary. It is the place where your choices matter most. The place where you decide who enters when they enter and under what circumstances. The more I thought about, the clearer everything became. Dorothy was not trying to take the house. She was trying to remove a boundary she did not personally value. And everyone around her seemed to assume that because the boundary was invisible, it did not exist. That night, lying awake beside Michael, I stared at the ceiling and made a quiet promise to myself. I was done wondering whether my feelings were reasonable. I was done apologizing for wanting privacy. Most importantly, I was done treating my discomfort like a misunderstanding that would eventually disappear. Because whether anyone else recognized it or not, something important was being challenged. And if I could not protect that boundary, I was afraid I would slowly stop feeling at home inside my own home. The moment everything changed was surprisingly small. There was no argument. No dramatic confrontation. No shocking discovery hidden inside a drawer. Instead, it happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, while I was helping Dorothy organize paperwork in her dining room. She had asked if I could assist her with sorting through old insurance documents and warranty information for household appliances. Since I was retired and had a flexible schedule, I agreed. For nearly 2 hours, we sat together at her dining room table creating neat piles of paperwork. The conversation remained pleasant. We discussed holiday plans, local events, and a television show we both enjoyed. Then Dorothy stood up to answer a phone call in the kitchen. While she was gone, I continued organizing papers. That was when I noticed a small yellow notepad sitting near the edge of the table. I was not trying to snoop. In fact, I almost ignored it entirely. But one line written near the top immediately caught my attention. It read, "Get house key copied after Michael gives original." I stared at the words for several seconds. At first, I thought I had misunderstood them. Then I read them again. And again. The meaning did not change. My stomach dropped. Dorothy returned a minute later carrying a glass of water. I quickly looked away from the notepad, not wanting her to realize what I had seen. The rest of the afternoon passed normally, at least on the surface. Inside, however, something fundamental had shifted. Driving home, I replayed that sentence over and over in my mind. The words themselves were simple, yet they revealed something I had not fully understood before. Dorothy was not hoping for a key. She was planning for one. In her mind, the question had already been settled. The only missing detail was timing. That evening, I sat at the kitchen counter while Michael prepared dinner. For several minutes, I debated whether to mention what I had seen. Eventually, I decided I could not keep it to myself. "I was at your mother's house today," I began. Michael nodded. "How did the paperwork project go?" I hesitated. Then I told him about the notepad. To my surprise, he stopped chopping vegetables almost immediately. "She wrote that down?" he asked. "Yes." Michael leaned against the counter and stared at the floor. Unlike previous conversations, he did not dismiss my concerns. He did not tell me I was overthinking things. Instead, he looked genuinely troubled. "That does sound strange." The response caught me off guard. "You think so?" He nodded slowly. "Because it assumes the decision has already been made." Hearing Michael say those words felt strangely validating. For months, I had struggled to explain why the situation bothered me. Now he was describing the exact feeling I had been carrying all along. Dorothy was not participating in a discussion. She was waiting for everyone else to arrive at the conclusion she had already accepted. Over the next few days, I noticed other examples. During a phone call, Dorothy casually mentioned that having a key would make holiday visits easier. During another conversation, she referred to future situations when she could just let herself in for a minute. None of the comments sounded aggressive. Yet each one treated access to our home as something already promised. The more I listened, the more obvious the pattern became. One Saturday morning, Ashley stopped by for coffee. I told her about the notepad. Her eyes widened immediately. "That is different." I nodded. "That is exactly how I felt." Ashley sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. "Grandma is not acting like someone waiting for permission. She is acting like someone waiting for delivery." The observation was so accurate that I laughed despite myself. Yet underneath the humor was a growing realization. Dorothy's behavior had crossed an invisible line. Not because she wanted a key, but because she no longer seemed interested in whether we actually wanted to give her one. That afternoon, after Ashley left, I walked through the house feeling more certain than I had in months. The confusion was gone. The self-doubt was gone. For the first time, I fully understood why the situation had become so emotionally exhausting. It was never about metal locks or convenience. It was about consent. It was about whether access to our home belonged to us or whether it could be claimed through persistence. And now that I finally understood the real issue, I knew something else as well. Sooner or later, Michael and I would have to stop avoiding the conversation altogether. Because the longer everyone pretended this was a simple request, the harder it became to address what it had actually turned into. The conversation I had been avoiding for months finally happened on a cold Sunday evening in January. Michael and I had just finished dinner. The dishes were still sitting in the sink, and the television played quietly in the family room. Nothing dramatic had happened that day. In fact, everything felt unusually calm. Maybe that was why I chose that moment. There were no distractions left. No excuses. No reason to postpone the discussion any longer. I sat across from Michael at the kitchen table and said something I had never said so directly before. "I need you to stop thinking about the key and start thinking about what it represents." Michael looked up immediately. His expression told me he already knew where the conversation was heading. Instead of changing the subject, he nodded. "Okay." That single word encouraged me more than he probably realized. For the next several minutes, I explained everything I had been struggling to put into words. I told him how Dorothy's repeated comments had changed the atmosphere around the issue. I told him about feeling pressured by relatives who only knew part of the story. I told him how exhausting it was to constantly defend a boundary that seemed obvious to me, but invisible to everyone else. Michael listened quietly. He did not interrupt. He did not rush to explain his mother's intentions. He simply listened. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for several seconds. Then he sighed. I think I finally understand why this feels different to you than it does to me. I waited. Michael rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. To me, the key was always about convenience. To you, it is about permission. The statement hit with surprising force because it was exactly right. Yes, I replied softly. That is it. Michael nodded slowly. And every time Mom acts like the answer is already yes, it feels like she is taking away your ability to decide. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt an enormous sense of relief. Not because the problem was solved, because someone else finally understood it. After months of explaining the situation from different angles, Michael had finally reached the heart of it himself. The next morning, I found him sitting alone in the breakfast nook drinking coffee before sunrise. He looked unusually thoughtful. When I asked what was on his mind, he gave a small smile. I have been thinking about boundaries. I sat down across from him. Michael stared out the window for a few seconds before continuing. Growing up, my mother was involved in everything. Every decision, every holiday, every family event. That just seemed normal. I nodded. He continued. I never stopped to ask whether other people experience family the same way. That observation stayed with me throughout the day. Sometimes people accept patterns simply because they have always existed. Not because the patterns are healthy. Not because they are fair. Just because they are familiar. A few days later, Michael received a phone call from Dorothy while we were organizing storage boxes in the garage. I could hear only his side of the conversation. At first, the discussion sounded ordinary. Then I heard the familiar topic appear once again. Michael remained silent for a moment. Before speaking carefully, Mom, we need to stop treating the key like it is already yours. I froze. Across the garage, Michael continued listening. His tone remained calm and respectful. No, that is not what I am saying. Another pause followed. I know you trust us. This is not about trust. He listened again. Then he added something that made my heart skip a beat. It is about respecting our decision whether the answer is yes or no. The conversation lasted only a few more minutes. Afterward, Michael placed his phone in his pocket and stood quietly beside the workbench. How did it go? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Not great. Then he smiled faintly. But probably necessary. For the first time since this situation began, I felt something shifting. Not in Dorothy. Not even in the family. In Michael. He was no longer standing in the middle trying to keep everyone happy. He was finally recognizing that avoiding a decision was also a decision. Every week we delayed the conversation. The pressure continued growing. Every joke, every assumption, every public comment became more powerful because nobody challenged it. Now that was changing. As we finished organizing the garage that afternoon, I realized something important. The hardest part of setting boundaries is often not saying no. It is believing you have the right to say no in the first place. And for the first time since Dorothy made her request, I felt certain that Michael and I were finally standing on the same side of the door. The moment everyone had been quietly moving toward arrived during a family gathering in early February. My sister-in-law hosted a birthday dinner for one of the grandchildren, and nearly the entire family attended. The atmosphere was warm and cheerful. Children ran through the house carrying balloons. Adults gathered around folding tables covered with food. For most of the evening, everything felt normal. In fact, I allowed myself to believe the key issue might finally be fading into the background. Then, shortly after dinner, someone unknowingly brought it back to center stage. A cousin was telling a story about locking himself out of his house. The conversation drifted naturally toward spare keys. Within seconds, several people were sharing their own arrangements. Some gave keys to neighbors. Others gave them to relatives. Then Dorothy smiled and looked directly at Michael. Maybe someday I will finally get one too. Several family members laughed. Under different circumstances, I might have laughed as well. But this time something felt different. Dorothy was not making a casual comment. She was revisiting a discussion that had already consumed months of attention. Around the room, a few relatives glanced toward me. Others looked at Michael. The familiar expectation settled over the table. Once again, everyone seemed to assume the conversation belonged to the family instead of the two people who actually lived in the house. I felt my shoulders tense. Not because I expected a fight. Because I expected the usual outcome. A joke. A change of subject. Another postponement. Instead, Michael placed his fork down on the table and calmly looked at his mother. The room grew quieter than I had ever heard it. "Mom," he said gently, "I think we need to stop talking about the key like it is something that is automatically going to happen." Dorothy blinked. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. Michael's tone remained respectful. There was no anger in his voice. No accusation. Just clarity. Dorothy forced a small smile. "I was only joking." Michael nodded. "Maybe. But it has come up for months." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. For the first time, everyone seemed willing to listen. Dorothy crossed her arms lightly. "I do not understand why this has become such a big issue." That statement might have ended the conversation months earlier. This time Michael answered it directly. "Because the decision belongs to Jennifer and me." The words landed with surprising weight. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were simple. Clear. Undeniable. Dorothy looked genuinely hurt. "I never said it did not." Michael nodded again. "I know. But sometimes it feels like you already decided for us." Silence followed. Across the table, I noticed Ashley watching the exchange carefully. She was not smiling. She was not taking sides. She simply looked relieved that the conversation was finally happening openly. Dorothy stared down at her plate for several seconds before speaking. "I was only trying to stay connected." The honesty in her voice changed the atmosphere immediately. The tension softened. For the first time, the conversation moved beyond the key itself. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Nobody is trying to push you away." Dorothy looked up. "Then why does it feel that way?" I finally spoke. My voice remained calm. "Because we have all been talking about access instead of connection." Dorothy looked confused. I continued carefully. "Having a key does not create closeness. Calling, visiting, spending time together. Those things create closeness." The room remained quiet. Nobody laughed. Nobody rolled their eyes. For perhaps the first time since this situation began, every person present seemed to understand that the discussion was not about a piece of metal. It was about expectations. Dorothy sat silently for a long moment. Then she sighed. "I suppose I never thought about it that way." It was not a complete resolution. It was not a dramatic breakthrough. But it was the first crack in an assumption that had existed for years. The conversation gradually moved on to other topics. Dessert was served. Children returned to playing games. Laughter slowly returned to the room. Yet something important had changed. On the drive home that night, neither Michael nor I spoke for several minutes. Finally, I looked at him and smiled. "Thank you." He glanced over. "For what?" I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. "For finally saying what needed to be said." Michael smiled quietly. "I think it was overdue." As we pulled into our driveway, I felt lighter than I had in months. The problem was not completely solved. Dorothy still had feelings to process. The family still needed time to adjust. But one thing was finally different. The pressure no longer lived in silence. The assumption had been challenged. And once an assumption is spoken aloud and examined honestly, it loses much of its power. 3 days after the family gathering, Dorothy called and asked if Michael and I would meet her for lunch. Her voice sounded different. Not upset. Not defensive. Just thoughtful. Michael looked at me after the call ended. "I think she wants to talk." I nodded. Deep down I knew the same thing. We met her at a small restaurant near the town square on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The lunch crowd had not arrived yet, and most of the tables were empty. Sunlight filtered through large front windows, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. Dorothy was already seated when we arrived. She smiled when she saw us, but there was something more subdued about her than usual. After we ordered our meals, the conversation stayed focused on ordinary topics for a while. Weather, family updates, local news. Eventually, however, Dorothy set down her coffee cup and looked directly at both of us. "I have been thinking about what happened at the birthday dinner." The table grew quiet. Michael nodded. So have we. Dorothy looked down for a moment before continuing. I do not think I realized how strongly you both felt about this. There was no accusation in her voice, only honesty. I appreciated that more than she probably realized. For months I had felt invisible in the discussion. Simply hearing her acknowledge our feelings felt significant. Dorothy folded her hands together. The truth is, I never thought of the key as a boundary. Michael listened carefully. What did you think it was? Dorothy smiled faintly. A sign that I still belonged. Her answer surprised me. Not because it was unreasonable, because it explained so much. Suddenly, dozens of conversations from the past year made more sense. The repeated requests, the public jokes, the persistence. None of it had been about locks or access. Dorothy had attached a deeper meaning to the idea. To her, the key represented inclusion, family, security. Aging had changed many things in her life. Friends had moved away. Neighbors had changed. Her world had gradually become smaller. Perhaps the key felt like reassurance that she still had a place inside ours. For several moments nobody spoke. Then I chose my words carefully. I understand why it feels important to you. Dorothy looked at me. I continued. But the reason it feels different to me is because I attach a different meaning to it. She nodded slowly. Privacy. Yes. The conversation remained calm. There was no winner. No loser. Just three people finally discussing the real issue instead of arguing about a symbol. Dorothy stared out the window for a moment. Maybe I was so focused on what the key meant to me that I never considered what it meant to you. Hearing those words felt like watching a locked door slowly open. Not because they solved everything. Because they showed understanding. Real understanding. Michael reached across the table and touched his mother's hand. Nobody wants you to feel excluded. Dorothy smiled sadly. I know that now. After lunch, we walked together through the small downtown area before heading home. The conversation shifted naturally to other topics. Family vacations. Spring gardening plans. Ashley's upcoming work project. The tension that had dominated so many interactions seemed noticeably lighter. A few days later, Dorothy called again. This time the conversation lasted only a few minutes. Before hanging up, she said something I never expected to hear. I think I owe you an apology. I stood quietly in the kitchen holding the phone. Dorothy continued. I kept treating my wishes like they should automatically become everyone else's decision. That was not fair. For a moment, I did not know what to say. Then I smiled. Thank you. After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table reflecting on everything that had happened. The strange thing was that nobody had actually changed their position very much. We still believed boundaries mattered. Dorothy still valued connection. The difference was that everyone finally understood each other's perspective. For months, the conversation had revolved around a key. Now I could see the truth clearly. The key was never the story. The real story was what happens when people assume their definition of family is the only correct one. Once that assumption disappeared, something remarkable happened. The conflict began disappearing with it. And for the first time since that Sunday dinner many months earlier, I felt like the door to a healthier relationship had finally started to open. Spring arrived quietly that year. The heavy winter skies gradually gave way to warmer afternoons, blooming trees, and open windows. Life settled back into familiar routines. Yet something important had changed inside our family. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. The tension that had surrounded every conversation for months seemed to dissolve little by little. One Saturday afternoon in April, I was planting flowers along the front walkway when I noticed a car pulling into the driveway. For a brief moment, an old feeling returned. The instinctive question of who was arriving and why. Then I saw Dorothy step out carrying a small container wrapped in a kitchen towel. What happened next made me smile before she even reached the porch. She walked directly to the front door and rang the bell. A simple action. One that most people would never think twice about. Yet standing there among newly planted flowers, I realized how much that small gesture meant. When I opened the door, Dorothy smiled warmly. I made too much soup again, she said. I thought you and Michael might enjoy some. I welcomed her inside. The visit felt easy, natural. Nobody seemed guarded. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. We spent the afternoon talking about gardening, family plans for the summer, and a new bakery that had recently opened downtown. At one point, Dorothy laughed and admitted she had probably spent more energy pursuing that key than she would have ever spent actually using it. We all laughed. Even her. The comment no longer carried tension because everyone finally understood the lesson hidden behind it. Later that evening, after Dorothy left, Michael and I sat together on the back patio watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange and gold beyond the trees. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Michael smiled and said something I will never forget. "You know, I think this was never really about Mom." I looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" He leaned back in his chair. "I think it was about learning how to protect our marriage without hurting our family." The words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because he was right. Throughout the entire situation, I had focused on Dorothy's behavior, the requests, the assumptions, the pressure. But beneath all of that was a deeper question. Could Michael and I create healthy boundaries while still remaining loving family members? For a while I was not sure. Now I knew the answer. A few weeks later, Ashley came over for lunch. As we sat in the kitchen eating sandwiches, she looked around and smiled. "Everything feels different in here." I laughed softly. "Different how?" Ashley thought for a moment. "Peaceful." The answer made me surprisingly emotional. Because peaceful was exactly the word I would have chosen. Not victorious. Not relieved. Peaceful. There had been no dramatic showdown. No permanent family division. No harsh punishment. Instead, there had been conversations. Understanding. Growth. The kind of change that takes longer but lasts much longer once it arrives. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I locked the front door before heading upstairs. As my hand touched the lock, I thought about the journey that simple piece of metal had taken us through. For months, I believed the story was about who should have a key. Eventually, I realized it was about something far more important. It was about respecting the difference between access and connection. Access can be demanded. Connection cannot. Access can be assumed. Connection must be built. Access opens a door. Connection opens a relationship. Dorothy eventually stopped asking for the key. Not because she gave up. Not because she lost. But because she finally understood that belonging to a family does not require unrestricted access to someone's home. And I finally understood something too. Boundaries are not signs of rejection. They are signs of clarity. They tell people how to love us in a way that allows everyone to feel respected. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I glanced once more toward the front door. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet somehow it represented something entirely different now. Not conflict. Not pressure. Not obligation. Just a home. Our home. A place where family would always be welcome. A place where love and respect could exist together. And a place where, when someone wanted to come inside, they would simply ring the bell.